Hello everyone, and welcome to this very special edition of Sketchy Legends. The two stories I'm going to tell you today are a couple of events that throughout my Uncle Howard's life, he has been unable to fully explain. A little background on him before we get started though. Howard is my dad's older brother. He grew up in Missoula, Montana, which was a much smaller community back then than it is now. He was in the Marine Corps for 6 years and a cop for a little over 20 years. He's not a person to exaggerate or tell tall tales, which makes these stories even creepier. So without further ado, sit back, relax, and enjoy this week's Sketchy Legends. In the early 1960s, in our childhood home in Missoula, Montana, we experienced a series of strange happenings. They seemed to start for no reason and stop almost as suddenly. The first one made us all look at each other in bewilderment. It was early evening and we had just finished dinner. My sister Lori and I had finished the dishes and went to join my mom and dad and brother Tom in the living room and watching some TV. In the kitchen, on the counter, was an electric stand. Now, you must remember that in this time in history, things such as this had manual switches. No fancy electronics back then. This stand mixer had one of the cloth covers on it because it wasn't being used or touched by anyone. For no apparent reason, it just came on. We all kind of jumped and looked at each other. Dad got up, followed by me and Tom to go check it out. Dad got there first and pulled up the cover on the stand mixer to see that it had started all on its own. The slide switch that marked the mixing speed from 1 to 10 was set to 3. Dad slid the switch to off, and we were just left in confusion. The mixer had never randomly started on its own since, and proceeded to function normally thereafter. Not long after that came the next incident. When everyone got home from either work or school, we all got ready to go out for the evening. It was the night of the Boy Scouts Blue and Gold Banquet, a dinner and awards event. This was held at the Orchard Homes Country Life Center on 3rd Street, about a mile away from home. We had left the house at about 5:30 in the evening, making sure everything in the house was secured, doors locked, windows latched, etc. The event had went well, and we all started the trek home, making it back around 9 p.m. When we entered the house, we heard the clothes dryer running in the utility room toward the back left corner of the house. On examination, the dial was set about halfway. If the dial were to have been fully turned, it would have been set on the max time for 1 hour before it would automatically shut off, which meant that the dryer had been running most likely for about 30 minutes. Dad had started to check the house for signs of a break-in. However, all the doors were still locked and all the windows were unbroken and still secured. At this point in time, we had a German Shepherd named King, but we had always secured him in the garage when we were gone, and no, he wasn't in the kitchen when the stand mixer came on by itself. For some time, some other small things occurred. Lights would be on for no reason at all times of the day, and we would find the water randomly running in the kitchen sink. However, what came next made me feel singled out. At this point in time, I was about 12 years old, and we had made a room in the basement for me. To get there, you had to exit the kitchen door and go to the garage and turn right. There would be another door that would open up into a steep flight of stairs leading into the basement. At the bottom of the stairs, there was another door. When going through that door, it would open up into the main area of the basement, which was split into a couple of different spaces. Straight ahead was a little workspace sectioned off with. And to the right, the basement opened into the main storage space, and to the very back of the basement, to the left, was the space sectioned off from my bedroom. This wasn't considered a finished basement like you'd see on realty shows these days. It was a standard, bare, cement floor basement, and still is to this day. From the time I had moved down there, King would sleep in my room with me at night. My normal nighttime routine was to call King over to the garage, and he would lead the way down the stairs to the basement. I would turn on the light to the stairway and make my way down to the bottom, open the door, and turn on the light in the first room, then run back over and turn off the stairway light and close the door. Now, the basement was crowded with junk, so to keep from tripping over things, I would walk across the first room, turn on the next light, and then the next one. These two lights didn't have wall switches, just a string that you had to pull. After those were lit, I would go back to the first light by the door and turn that one off. I would walk back across the basement to my room, turn on the final light in there, and then go back into the junk room to turn off the furthest light and then the closest to my bedroom. This sequence is essential to understanding what comes next. Shortly after everything had happened up in the main house, the mixer, and the dryer running, odd things started happening in the basement. One night, I called King and we started to head for my room. When we got to the top of the stairs, King stopped cold. Normally, he would beat me to the bottom. I went around him, not thinking much of it. I got close to the door at the bottom of the stairs, opened it, and turned on the light. I looked back and realized that King was still at the top. I called him and he just stood there and whimpered. I gave him my best "get down here" call. He slowly started the descent, but he stopped halfway down and whimpered again, turned around and ran right back up to the top of the stairs and laid down. All I could think is, what the hell? I wasn't going to spend a lot of time on him, so I closed the bottom of the stairwell door and continued to my normal light switch routine. And for the sole purpose of not having to repeat myself, I'll add at this point that King refused to come downstairs from this point on. At about 1 a.m, I woke up and rolled over and noticed that all the lights were on outside my room. I got up and walked back to the door at the bottom of the stairwell and proceeded to turn off all the lights in order. I returned back to my room and didn't think too much of it. I briefly considered that maybe I had forgotten to turn them off before I went to bed, but it was unlikely because I specifically recalled pulling the strings to turn them off. Or someone must have come downstairs while I was sleeping and hadn't turned them off on their way out. A few nights later, again I woke up at around 1 a.m. and once again noticed that all the lights were on outside my room. It was becoming a pain in my ass, so I decided that in the morning I was going to find out who was coming downstairs and leaving the lights on. When I woke up in the morning, I went upstairs to join the others for breakfast. I asked my family who was leaving the lights on. They all looked at me like I was nuts. I was assured that Tom and Lori had never left their rooms and that my parents had gone to bed at midnight and neither had gone downstairs. I was left scratching my head and confused, but I let it go until a couple of nights later it happened again. Now, that was it. Somebody was screwing with me and I was hell-bent on stopping it. I confronted my family again, and once again, they assured me that none of them were responsible. I knew that somebody had to be lying. All day, I thought about the problem and came up with a plan to catch the culprit. There was no way to get into the basement without using the door at the bottom of the stairwell or breaking one of the small windows high up on the wall that were level with the ground outside. I devised a plan to utilize the stairway door as an alarm system. The door opened inward toward the basement, so I took about a dozen empty and partially empty paint cans and stacked them 4 high, tight against the inside of the closed basement door right before I went to bed. With this plan, anyone that would open the door would topple the cans, causing enough noise to wake me up, and if they did manage to open the door without knocking the cans over, they would have no way of setting them back up against the inside of the door on their way out of the basement. Thus, at the very least, I would know that at least someone had been down there. I didn't tell anyone about my plan. I was eager to catch the culprit, so I ran downstairs at bedtime, quietly set up my cans so no one would hear me and suspect anything, and then I went to bed. I repeated this for the next couple of nights, with no results. I'd wake up in the morning and the lights would be off and the cans would be unmoved. However, on the third night I had gotten my answer. I set up my cans like I had done the last couple of nights, and did my light routine and proceeded to bed. I randomly woke up at 1 a.m., the same time I had woken up the other 2 times that the lights had been found on. I once again noticed that the lights were on. My first thought was that I hadn't heard the cans fall, so I jumped out of bed and ran over to check my trap. When I approached the door, the hair on the back of my neck immediately stood up. The cans were stacked against the door exactly how I had left them. No one had used the door, and only one person was in the basement, and that was me. The only explanation that I could come up with was that I was sleepwalking and turning on the lights. But now I had decided that I needed to set a trap for myself to prove that I had been out of bed, something that I wouldn't be able to reset. I had thought about putting tape or string on my door or on myself so that if I moved or opened the door, it would disturb the tape or string. However, I dismissed that idea, thinking I could probably fix those in my sleep if I was indeed sleepwalking. What I decided on could in no way be fixed in my sleep if I were to get out of bed. I got a bucket of sand and spread a thin layer of it on the concrete floor around the perimeter of my bed, just enough to where if I got up, it would leave footprints, and have sand on my feet and as well as having sandy sheets from returning back to bed. This time, it only took 2 nights for it to happen again. I did the routine I had been doing for the last few days. I ran downstairs for bed, turned on all the lights, set up the paint cans by the closed stairwell door, turned all the lights off, poured sand on the floor around my bed, and went to sleep. Then I woke up to the lights being on again. Before I got out of bed, I decided to check my feet. No sand. I checked my sheets. No sand. And then finally, I checked the floor. No footprints. I got out of bed and rushed over to the door, and once again, the cans had not been moved. I was baffled. There was nothing else I could do. I just accepted that it was going to happen, which it did many more times. Eventually, I just gave up getting up and turning them off. I would wake up, see them being on, and just roll over and go back to sleep. Eventually, I had enlisted in the Marine Corps, but when I had gotten out and returned home, I decided to ask my parents about the lights again. It had always bothered me. I figured that they had been doing it to me all these years and been chuckling about it. However, they were both very adamant, and convincingly so, that they had nothing to do with the lights being turned on in the basement. I searched for answers for many years and could only come up with one thing that made sense. It had occurred to me that time may have been a factor. This may be truly reaching, but here it goes. Just prior to these described events, my grandpa and grandma on my father's side had passed away. When I was little, I had spent loads of time over at their small 4-bedroom house. Well, okay, it was more like a shack. Grandpa was a retired soldier and had always let me handle his military belongings when I was little. He was the reason why I became such a big military history buff. When he died, he had left me this footlocker that contained his military uniform, his medals, some photographs, and the flag that was draped over his casket. He wanted me to have them. My grandma died shortly after. I hung his military uniform in my closet and stored the footlocker under my bed. One day, my Aunt Susie, my dad's sister, came over to the house to talk to me. Her parents had very little to pass on to their children, and I had a footlocker full of mementos, which was more than anyone had gotten from my grandparents. Susie was hoping that I might let her have some of the photos from the footlocker. It was only fair in my mind. I kept the uniform and gave her the locker, the flag, and the photos. After giving my aunt these items, the lights never came on by themselves again, and in just a few days of them leaving the house, King would start coming back down to the basement and sleep with me every night for the next 8 years until I set off for boot camp. I'm not saying that this is the reason that all those events occur. It could just be a huge coincidence. I'll let you decide and see if you have a theory. In this next story, I've grown up and moved out of my parents' house. I'm out of the Marines and working as a cop in Missoula, Montana, the same town that I grew up in. What happened here almost made me want to move out of our house because it was a little too close for comfort. I was living in a grouping of homes in a small subsection of the northwest side of Missoula called Elmar Estates, an area where all the streets were named after different kinds of birds. Elmar Estates was right off of Mullen Road and right next to a cemetery called Sunset Memorial Gardens. I'll insert a map here for visual reference. It was dark, and there was a light snowfall with about a 2-inch dusting of the stuff on the ground. With a full moon out reflecting off the fresh snow, visibility was pretty good. I was out on shift on patrol. A fellow cop, Joe Sampson, was working Zone 1 and had gotten a possible domestic disturbance call out in New Meadows Drive, which was sandwiched between Elmar Estates and the Sunset Memorial Cemetery. I was driving over to back him up, but was several minutes behind. As I was climbing the hill by the cemetery, I saw a man standing on the side of the road by a big fir tree and a little blue building. He didn't appear to be dressed for a Montana winter. No hat, no gloves, no coat. Just a rumpled gray suit and white socks, but no shoes. It was kind of hard to see his face from where I was at, but what I could tell, he had a blank expression and didn't even watch me as I drove by. Just as I passed him, Joe came over the radio and said that I could cancel backup. He had taken care of the call. I checked and said that I had seen this guy outside the cemetery on the side of the road and was gonna go back and check it out. Joe came back over the radio and said, "The guy in the old suit?" Joe had seen him too. I pulled into the driveway of the cemetery and turned around and drove back toward where I had seen him. However, when I got there, he was gone. I told dispatch that I would be out of the car looking for him. I pulled into the driveway of the little blue building by the fir tree and got out to start looking around. I marched over to where the man had been standing, figuring that with the fresh snow it would be pretty easy to track him down from his footprints. Again, with it being a full moon out, it was bright enough to see clearly, clear enough to see all the way down the hill. When I had gotten to where he was originally standing, I came to the realization that there were no tracks in the snow, not a single disturbance. Joe then pulled up and stepped out of his patrol car and made his way over to me. He told me that I was standing right where he had seen the guy in the gray suit. We both checked the area and there were no tracks other than the ones that we had just made. We stood there and just looked at each other without saying anything. When we finally spoke up, we decided that we would drive to the bottom of the hill and check out more of the cemetery and its surroundings. Joe took on a place called Topaz, and I got the rest of the cemetery. And away we went. I drove on each road within the cemetery bounds. As I rounded behind the main building, my headlights swung across the ground, and I saw him. He was standing no more than 20 feet from my car, looking away from me to the east. He was standing at the edge of the hill that looked over where Joe was sitting. As I got out of the car, he proceeded to step off the hill and disappear. I radioed Joe, letting him know that the guy was headed his way, and then I started toward him on foot. Joe said that he could see me, and I ran over toward where the guy had been. You could see everything from there down the hill. But when I got to the edge, the man was nowhere to be seen. Joe said that he had never seen the guy this time, and again, there weren't any footprints in the fresh snow. Sometimes you need to just get back in the car and leave, and this was one of those times. I drove down to meet up with Joe. We looked at each other, and Joe made a statement. "Howard, I'm not telling anyone. They'll never believe it." And I had agreed, and we both drove off. One last thing before ending this story. That last time I saw the man in the gray suit at the edge of the hill, he was for sure not wearing any shoes, only socks. Most of the time, they don't put shoes on the body in the casket. I hope you all have enjoyed this week's special edition of Sketchy Legends. I have quite a few more stories from my uncle that I'll tell in the future, but for now, here's just a little taste of them. If you liked this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and to leave a comment down below. If you're new to this channel, feel free to subscribe so you don't miss any more tales of the unexplainable. If you'd like to see more work from me and keep up to date with things happening with my channel, head on over and follow me on Instagram and Twitter at j_dfiore_art. Thank you all so much for watching, and have a good night.